All right, so this particular webinar, we're going to talk about what we would do if we woke up evil one day. Like I said, John will be joining us shortly. We have Derek Banks is also with me. Derek, can we hear you?
Hello, everyone. This is Derek.
All right, awesome. So yeah, like I said, John will be joining us shortly. He's just having some technical difficulties getting signed in. So whenever we started putting this presentation together, we perform pen tests for a number of companies, and each time we go into doing like a black box style approach, it always crosses our mind, what could we do differently, or what can we do to kind of bridge that gap, or try to push the threshold as far as we possibly can, and do something new. So that kind of got us, obviously going down the line of thought, what if we did something very, very malicious or did something evil? How would we actually approach it from a true attacker's point of view? So let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, can everybody see my screen? Let's see. Cool, awesome. Thank you guys. All right, so let's jump right in. What if we woke up evil? So this particular presentation, I'm going to focus on a few main items. Particularly, the first one is going to be non-attribution, so us not getting caught. And this particular item, I spent a lot of time thinking about, or we spent a lot of time just discussing and trying to go through the different ways that we would go about attacking an organization and, not having it actually trace back to us. So throughout this presentation, you'll see how we actually developed our own attack platform of sorts, where we basically spent the entire time just making sure we didn't get caught through every step of the way. And then we'll talk about target acquisition, how we're going to go about finding finding targets to attack. We're going to talk about performing recon on those targets, how we're going to go about exploiting them, and then ultimately we'll talk about how we could potentially make money off of it and profitize off of it. So before we jump right into how we would do it, let's talk about some guys who did it poorly, who had bad OPSEC and got caught. So the first one, Jeremy Hammond, who was the Stratford hacker. The feds busted down his door, and immediately he closed his laptop, which encrypted it, which is, that's probably, reasonably OPSEC safe, right? Like thinking, hey, my laptop's encrypted. Well, he chose a really poor password, and they were able to guess his password to get into his laptop. It was his cat's name 123. You look at the like lolsec hackers. When you start getting a group of people together to have your hacking group, there's always more potential for error whenever certain members start having bad OPSEC themselves. So we'll talk about how like the three of us, we're talking about how we'd each do some sort of non-attribution in general, but in the end, we'd probably end up doing it alone, just because it's safer that way. It's not as easy to track down one person as opposed to six. Ross Ulbricht, who is the quote-unquote mastermind behind the Silk Road. So Silk Road, if you don't know, that's probably the highest or the most profitable drug market that ever happened. So Ross Ulbricht was the mastermind behind that, and he got caught. And we're actually going to focus on him a little bit more here. So Ross Ulbricht, also known as the Dread Pirate Roberts, some things he did wrong and how he kind of got caught. He basically boasted on LinkedIn. He actually had his own personal LinkedIn profile where he actually talked about creating an economic simulation where he was going to bypass government protocols and everything. So that's probably not the best thing to put if you're going to do illegal stuff. He also put his real face on fake IDs whenever he went to purchase virtual private service. We're going to talk about purchasing some VPSs here in a bit as well for our setup. But he actually, to actually verify his identification, literally put his real face on the fake IDs. I mean, he could have put anyone's face there. I mean, it wasn't like he was actually buying it in person. He also asked advice on Stack Overflow about how to code Silk Road. So particularly, he was like, how do I connect to a Tor hidden service with PHP and curl? And tracing it back, it's just like he made all these errors. along the way that helped him get caught. He actually tried to hire an undercover cop to perform a hit for him. I mean, that's kind of tough to make sure that the guy you're trying to hire to kill somebody doesn't actually, work for the government. But it's one of those things. You got to be careful who you work with. Again, working with people can lead to your demise as an attacker. There was actually a technical vulnerability in Silk Road itself. So there was actually a point where Tor had an IP publishing leak, and it actually leaked Silk Road's actual server's IP address, public IP address. And that was one of the steps where they immediately were like, oh, hey, we know where the server is now. Let's go confiscate the server. And then that eventually led back to where Ross was actually accessing the server from.
I
Which
just wanted to
was
say
Cafe.
I made it.
Oh, hey, John Strand's here. Hey, John.
Sorry. Sorry, everybody. This was a total dumpster fire for me to try to get into this. I did find the solution to my problem, though, and it involved me rebooting my computer, and everything came
IT
back just
101.
fine. IT 101. I turned it off and on again, and everything came back. So I'm going to get off camera. I just wanted to say hi to everybody, and I'll go on mute, and I'll jump in and interject periodically, and I'll do my best to interject with questions as they're asked. If you guys have any questions, please type them in, and we'll be sure to answer those as we proceed. So thank you so much. Continue on, Bo.
Thanks, John. So yeah, he accessed the Silk Road from a cafe from a block from his house. So we're going to talk about moving around, and we're going to talk about using Wi-Fi hotspots at various locations. But it's probably not the best idea to just access it a block from your house. So whenever we go into this process of building our own system, we're going to try to avoid his mistakes. One, we're not going to trust any other humans, which is a big step. We're going to build an attack infrastructure with the most important element being OPSEC. So a lot of people are like, oh, I need to build this attack infrastructure that's going to help me profitize the most. But really, the most important thing is not getting caught, because the second you get caught, it doesn't matter anymore. And then maintaining an anonymity in both the real and digital world. So, a lot of this, we talk about buying and selling of various, different types of services. So, like, let's say we bought a VPS with Bitcoin or something. How we get that Bitcoin needs to be very much an anonymous manner too, because if it ever traces back to us from the actual payment point of view, that could be a very bad thing. So some necessities for our non-attrib setup. We're going to have a laptop to work from, maybe a prepaid cell phone. Obviously, we're going to need internet. We're going to have a series of VPN and proxies set up, which you'll see in a few slides, the actual full-on setup we did. And then, some command and control and attack servers. Additionally, having some sort of non-attrib currency, like I mentioned before, is very important. So something like Bitcoin, or even having just like prepaid Visa cards that you bought with cash. Laptops. Buying laptops easy, at least anonymously. It's pretty easy. You go to Craigslist, find a number of people selling laptops for cash. Internet. So free Wi-Fi at coffee shops. That's the typical mindset, right? When you go into thinking, oh, I'm going to do something malicious. Let me go to the first place I can find. The caveat here is, we want to try to stay a long distance away from our residence. So I particularly put the number 50 miles. I mean, that's kind of just a number I threw out there, but the reason I chose that number is because there was actually a story that I was reading where a hacker was performing malicious acts, but he was actually accessing his attack infrastructure from various organizations like coffee shops 10 miles from his house in different directions. So he would access it from coffee shop 10 miles north, McDonald's 10 miles east, some other store 10 miles south, and he eventually just built this circle around his house. The cops were like he's obviously in this area. Let's go find him. So that's just something important to think of too. Is whenever you're actually accessing your attack infrastructure that you're going to be using to do very malicious things, you should probably not be too close to your actual residence. So some things, when you go into one of these coffee shops and you're hacking away, you don't want to just be the sore thumb in the room with a huge monitor like this guy has here, or even like this sock thing this lady's hiding under. It's not really OPSEC safe, right?
That is something about that snuggly that's just dirty. I don't know.
Yeah, what is she actually doing
Why? I
under there?
think that's wrong.
Is that really a laptop under there is the question.
We're just going to assume that it is. We're just going to assume that it is.
So a bit more OPSEC safe, get some power for let's say out in your car, right? Like you can power a laptop out in the car. Don't actually go into the building. Get a Yagi antenna. You can access, the actual hotspot you're hacking from. Let's say half a mile away even. You get, obviously an Alpha card to help power the Yagi, and then you end up looking something like this. Like a true hacker with a beanie, and you get the Yagi antenna, and a legit black hat and everything, right? Because you can't do any hacking without either like a beanie or a black hoodie, right? I mean, it just doesn't work that
This
way.
doesn't arouse any suspicion whatsoever from police officers.
I,
No,
I would
none.
I would actually like to point out that it was really, really cold that night. And our story was that we were going to be hunting for ghosts, and we were some ghost hunter, duo, and that building was obviously haunted.
That's right. So, moving on. So we're going to actually talk about our attack architecture setup and how we would actually go about building this quote unquote attack infrastructure. So obviously, we're never going to directly attack an organization from our local system, right? Like we're never going to point our local host where we're operating from at an organization. We're going to use a number of virtual private servers in different areas to kind of route our traffic through and create a sort of mask of where we're at. And then in order to be non-attributable, we're going to use alternate identities and various currencies. And to talk about buying Bitcoin, I'm going to let Derek jump in here. So Derek, take it away.
Oh yeah, so it was my task to go try and buy some Bitcoin anonymously, and so the first option I explored was to try and buy it locally for cash. So it turned out at the time, locally to me, I live in Virginia, there were folks who were selling Bitcoin that I could go to in person. However, the minimum was 1 Bitcoin, and at the time that was $400, and I really didn't need $400 in Bitcoin to get a VPS. So I looked for a different way and looked online. And so, online, it was actually surprisingly difficult. Everyone kind of wanted some, way to trace it back to me. But we did find this site called Paxful.com that accepted prepaid Visa cards, and they gave a list of the type of prepaid Visa cards that they would take. And so I went to the local ATM, and I'll admit, since I wasn't doing this as an actual attacker, the ATM was less than a mile from my house, and the drugstore was right next to the ATM. Not the brightest thing to do if you were actually being an attacker, but I didn't think that I was going to actually be traced. So that's what I did. And so if you go to Paxful.com, you're essentially trading the Visa card to another person for an amount of Bitcoin. And then there's also a fee, so you're not actually getting the full amount. They're losing probably somewhere around 20% of the value, but I was able to get enough for 2 months of the VPS essentially. And then one other caveat to it that I found was that you had to actually upload a picture of the VPS or a picture of the card rather, to the person that you were trading for Bitcoin. And so my first thought was, oh, what about the EXIF data? Because I took the picture with my smartphone. So don't forget about the EXIF data. And one other caveat, to create the email address, you did have to have an email address. I created a Yahoo account, and the Yahoo account did require an actual phone number. So that's where the burner phone really came in. And when I went to go get the burner phone, I went to the local 7-Elevens, again, because I'm lazy. 7-Eleven doesn't actually have burner phones if you actually go to them. I had to drive to the Walmart. But, I paid in cash and seemed to be kind of anonymous there because the Walmart, is huge. And so that was pretty much, it ended up being kind of easy to have an anonymous online wallet that would be relatively unattributable to me.
Yep, and then we basically moved from that point of getting an anonymous wallet into then buying actual virtual private servers with Bitcoin, which there are a number of other sites. Which Derek, which one did you actually end up setting up with?
So I actually went before I actually went to your keynote and didn't see Liberty VPS. I actually settled on Liberty VPS. They were in Norway, and I set up a VPN to from my machine to the server in Norway. And sure enough, in my testing, I took a couple of PCAPs, and it looked like the only thing that was leaking out was DNS, and that was sort of outside of the scope of what I wanted to fix. But yeah, they took Bitcoin and used email addresses that weren't mine, and everything worked out just great.
I would also add in another thing at this point. You've got to make sure that your customer or your company that you're working for is okay with you doing this. And let me explain. If you are pen testing an organization and you're routing all of your traffic through some weird VPS that accepts Bitcoin, there's a very distinct possibility that the customer doesn't know that this is what you're doing, that they would be very uncomfortable with the idea of you doing this. Because some of these hosting providers, just saying that they're a bit sketchy and shady is putting it mildly. So whenever you do this, you need to make sure that you've gone through and kind of clarified with the customer, this is what you're doing. Bad guys may not care if a VPS gets access to potential data associated from a red team or a pen test, but some customers will absolutely care. So just make sure that it's completely cleared and vetted by your customer before you actually do this stuff. Otherwise, whenever you're doing the report, you're saying, yeah, we want this shady VPS that accepts Bitcoins and they're based out of Russia. You might have some customers that completely lose their minds because of that.
Yeah, speaking of shady VPS, Derek, I bet you were about to say exactly what I think you're about to say.
So speaking of shady, on the Liberty VPS server, I ran last just to see, hey, who logged in last. Last was not found as a command. I actually tried to find it. It was not on the server. Huh. Interesting. And, as John said, this particular customer that we were working with, it was completely black box, get in from the outside, have a nice day kind of thing. So, yeah, they totally were okay with it.
All right, so after we've gone ahead and bought our quote-unquote VPS servers, there's a few things that I want to set up. So I want to set up two totally different networks from two totally different VPS companies, and let me explain why. So the first one, I'm going to have a VPN server that we're going to VPN out to from our Wi-Fi hotspot. In that VPN, in that first VPS network, we'll have a management server that we'll connect to, and that will be kind of our primary operation base that will allow us to connect to our actual attack infrastructure in the other VPS network. And you'll see, I have all this in a nice little workflow that you'll get to see here in a second to kind of explain why. Because, I mean, the main thing is that tracking all this back to where we're actually sitting is going to be very hard. You'll see. VPS, so possibly maybe having a password cracker out there too, just be, for usefulness. And one of the reasons I wanted to put that out in the actual VPS network is because I really don't want to have anything ever stored locally, meaning password hashes or any data whatsoever. Just that, for the fact that if anyone ever did actually, bust down a door and grab a laptop, then, you don't have anything locally stored. I mean, it's all, network traffic at that point. So our VPS network 2 is where we're going to have our primary attack infrastructure. So we're going to have a command and control server to accept incoming connections, as well as just a standard attack system. For connectivity, we're going to actually VPN into the first VPS network, like I said, and then SSH over to VPS network 2. The caveat being is that we're going to route all of the traffic from VPS network 1 through Tor and then to VPS network 2. And that'll look something kind of like this. So we've got our laptop connected to our main free Wi-Fi hotspot at Starbucks down the road or whatever. From there, we've VPN'd up to our first VPS network. We've SSH or RDP'd or VNC'd to our management server in that network. That traffic then gets routed all through Tor, which is going to hit at least like 3 proxy nodes, and then up to VPS network 2, where we have our actual attack infrastructure. So the target organization should only ever see like maybe 2 IPs coming from us ever. And it's basically just going to be our command and control server and the primary attack server. And I've had some people ask like, well, why didn't you just, route all your traffic through Tor directly? Why didn't you just go from the laptop through Tor up to VPS network 2, or route from VPS network 1 through Tor and then to the attack infrastructure? Well, there's been a lot of attacks against Tor itself. If you can actually have control over the entry and exit nodes, there's been some attacks where you can actually attribute the originating IP using Tor. So from the target organization, let's say they did see the public IPs of our VPS network 2 systems. They trace that back to VPS network 2. They go to this shady Bitcoin hosted service and say, hey, who is accessing your network, and where were they accessing it from? If we had actually purchased those servers anonymously, like we plan to do with anonymous Bitcoin, first off, they're not going to really be able to identify us based off of who bought the systems. Secondly, all the traffic coming to that network is going to be through Tor, and unless somebody's has the ability to man the middle Tor and figure out where that traffic's coming from, that might stop right there, like the trail to us. If, for example, somebody does have control of Tor and can figure out where VPS network 1 is, they're going to have to go back to the VPS network 1, which again, it's going to be another shady Bitcoin VPS service that potentially, may or may not provide the information they need. One thing that I thought was kind of interesting, and I'm still not certain on whether or not this is possible or not, is how well some of the VPS networks actually log internal traffic on the same network. And so what I mean by that is, so the VPN server and the management server, they typically will provide a local public LAN IP as well as your public IP that you've bought from the service. So you can actually access over internal public LAN space. And I'm wondering if some of these VPS networks are actually even logging that, like on the inside of their network. I mean, there's a good chance that they're logging activity, coming into the public IP space from the outside, but the actual private IP space on the inside of the network, I'm wondering if, the trail might die there too. Eventually, if somebody did track it back to that initial VPN server and they see, somebody's VPN from wherever, it's going to show up as like just a Starbucks hotspot somewhere, which is, I'm not likely going to be there by the time they get to that point. And the thing is like I said, we're going to, mix up where we're going to be accessing it from as well. So the thing I know probably everyone's thinking is like, wow, like that's got to be like the most ridiculous latency ever. Like how does that even work? Well, we actually set it up, and it's not that bad. The latency is not that bad. So I live booted off a USB Linux distro. I connected to free Wi-Fi at Starbucks. I VPN'd up to my VPS network 1. I then VNC'd to my management server that was within VPS network 1. I set up Tor to route all of my network traffic from VPS network 1 over to VPS network 2. Then I SSH'd over Tor to VPS network 2. You can actually see in my screenshot here, I did a net stat, and you can actually see where Tor is saying, hey, yeah, the browser appears to be configured to use Tor, and then on the actual the shell, the SSH shell I have over to VPS network 2, I did a net stat, and it only sees the public exit node IP from Tor. So you can tell that I'm actually routing all my traffic through Tor. Of course, I've got a Metasploit box up there for good measure, and of course the mandatory caffeination, because hacking needs caffeine. So let's talk about actually acquiring our targets. We could go about just having easy targets to find, which you'll see here. That's probably going to be like the name would suggest, the easiest way to go. You could pick high-profile targets, the ones that might help make more money or have a bigger profit. Contracted targets, maybe eventually, like if you become like some sort of like, I don't know, famous hacker of sorts, you could have people trying to contract you into doing specific targeting. Or you could just, go like Mr. Robot style and just have vengeance against the company. So let's talk about easy targets first. So Shodan, a service that scans all of the internet, has a wonderful, wonderful method of finding unauthenticated VNC servers that are on the internet. So these are servers that you can VNC to that do not require authentication to access them. So here's just a few examples. Here's a Windows system out in Switzerland, just wide open, VNC right to it. Here's another Windows system in Taiwan. Here's a Windows server in Portugal. Here's some sort of industrial control system in Greece. And then a Mac for good measure. And this, like, within 15 minutes of being on Shodan looking for unauthenticated VNC servers, this is the kind of stuff you come up with. It's very easy to find wide open systems that require no authentication on the internet. So as an attacker, you find these and you're in, and it's golden.
And just for the record, there's been a lot of people that are asking, well, the NSA can deobfuscate Tor, the NSA can deobfuscate Tor, and that's true. And what we're talking about here is whenever you're worried about that type of deobfuscation, this is the point where you would bounce through a compromised computer system in a matter of 15 minutes with Shodan. So yeah, we would use Tor for most of our assessments because we aren't too worried about the NSA hunting us down and putting us into prison. But if we actually tripped into actually being pure evil, we would gain access to these computer systems. Now, for the record, Bo did not gain access to these computer systems. Shodan has the capability of doing screenshots. I know that some of you guys are very, very, very nervous whenever this starts popping up. And yeah, then you could use these systems as pivot points. Absolutely, Tobias just brought up, you would absolutely use these as pivot points and then access your Tor network from that point.
Yep. So next, vulnerable services. So instead of us going and running a vulnerability scan against a target organization, how about we just use Shodan and search for vulnerable services that have already shown up with banners that Shodan has scanned. So something like this, VSFTP, FTPD 2.3.4 has a Metasploit exploit already available, and via Shodan you can find servers like this that are just publicly available on the internet. And I think this particular one had like 200 results. 200 servers that have an exploit ready to go pop them today. So another easy target. We could go for high-profile targets. Find the hospitals, find the enterprises of the world. Maybe that's more down our alley for targeting. If we're pure evil, right? Like we could go say, hey, I don't like this company. I'm going to go target them specifically. Contracted targets, like I said, maybe one day, if we were truly evil, somebody might try to just pay us to go do a particular hit on a customer. This particular website is actually real, surprisingly. You can actually go buy a hitman in the dark web, kind of scary for Bitcoin. Vengeance, so Mr. Robot style, if we just don't like that company over there, just go attack them. So after we've decided who we're going to target, it becomes performing more reconnaissance on that specific target to figure out the best way to approach getting into their network. So one of the things that I really like obtaining is just the username infrastructure, and you'll see why in a few slides why that becomes really important. Credentials and previous breaches, so things like we used to use pwn list, now we use have I been pwned to obtain actual credentials from previous breaches. External network ranges, that's pretty easy to find in most cases during the reconnaissance phase. We're going to use sites like Shodan, like I showed before, and Census is another one now, to discover open ports on some of the systems that we would like to target. Again, we're going to look for low-hanging fruit and locate external login portals. So if we find external login portals, that can generally lead us down a path of gaining actual credentials to a network, which I'll talk more about shortly. So the actual exploitation phase, after we've gained some sort of information about the external infrastructure of an organization, let's talk about 3 different ways that I would approach personally for attacking these organizations. So the first one, credential reuse. It's probably one of the biggest problems that a lot of organizations face is whenever employees of their organization use the same username and password on an external service. So how can we actually exploit credential reuse on personal accounts? Because a lot of times, we'll run like the domain of let's say the target organization we would like to get credentials of against something like pwn list or have I been pwned, and a lot of times that will come back, and an employee may have used their exact email address from the organization as a username for a particular organization. But what if they didn't use their actual corporate login? What if they used, let's say a personal address on an external site? How could we find those? Well, one example that I found was an organization that actually supplied their own email addresses for customers of their organization. So think of something like a Google, right? Like if you're a customer, I mean it's free, but you're a customer of Google, you get a Gmail address. Now, if let's say I put Gmail up against something like pwn list and get a list back of everyone who's ever been compromised that had a Gmail address. It's going to be a very large list, but let's say it wasn't massive. One particular organization we were working with had a similar infrastructure where they supplied email addresses for their customers. And when I ran the organization's email address against Pwn list, it came back with 50,000 results. So I was able to actually get access to 50,000 usernames and either clear text or hashed credentials for 50,000 of their customers. Now that becomes kind of a gray area, right? Because a lot of those users are not necessarily employees of the company, but how would you go about finding if some of those credentials you were able to gather were actually employees of the company, and it'd be their personal addresses? Well, there's a site called Pipple where you can actually search via email address and find information about people. Pipple kind of consolidates a lot of the social media sites together and makes it kind of a nice search engine for just searching for people. So what I did is I actually used Burp Intruder to submit all 50,000 of those email addresses to Pipple.com. And then in the results that I got back from Pipple, I just grepped for the company's name that I was testing. And sure enough, I mean, it basically from like, I guess, like LinkedIn results and wherever else these people posted that they worked at this company would come back. And I actually ended up with like 252 personal email addresses of people who worked at this company. And in the screenshot here, you can see like it was a manager, network operations support at the X company. And so I got 252 credentials at that point that could potentially be somebody that works at the company, which then becomes like, okay, can I now translate the personal addresses over to corporate addresses and attempt to log into an external portal? So something like if they had an Outlook web access portal externally, could we then just go log in right into their account? And a lot of times, if they use the same password on another account, whether it be for their personal account or if they use the same corporate email address, a lot of times it just works. So there's plenty of times where we'll go into an assessment for an organization and already have credentials before we even start. Attack number 2, password spraying. So again, this is another external attack that works very well for us in a lot of cases. So if you're an organization and you have an external portal like an OA, like an Outlook Web Access, or any sort of external portal that actually is tied back to like an LDAP authentication, a lot of times we can perform attacks to gain access to actual domain credentials externally. So let me explain. So what password spraying is, if you've never heard of password spraying is kind of the opposite of the approach that brute forcing takes. So brute forcing, you take let's say one email address or one username and you try a million passwords against it, but you're quickly going to lock out accounts if there's some sort of lockout threshold. And a lot of times companies have default lockout thresholds, something like five attempts, and then you lock out the account. So how do you get around that? Password spraying, you take all of the usernames for an organization and you try one password against it. So you kind of avoid that lockout threshold completely. And if you choose a good password, choose something that would relatively be something that would fit a password policy and would be common enough that is what potentially something somebody would pick in an organization. You can get a lot of hits for that. So the way we typically go about getting usernames externally, it's a little bit harder, just because externally you don't have the ability to, let's say, run net users / domain, which if you're on an internal Windows domain, you can just run net users / domain, and you can get all the users from the domain. But externally, you have to figure out how to get those usernames, right? I mean, it's not always just email address. It's not always just blatant that it's like first initial last name. So one of the ways that I like to go about doing it is using a tool called FOCA. FOCA will go out to the target organization's domain and perform basically like Google and Bing searches, looking for publicly available files. So it'll look for things like PDFs, Excel files, doc files, and then go and pull all of those down. And so the reason we do this is because a lot of times whenever you create those types of files on an internal network, it will actually create metadata attached to those files. Like Derek mentioned the EXIF data a little bit ago. If if, for example, you created a PDF on an internal network, a lot of times it could actually tie your internal username to that file, and it's actually in the metadata attached to the file. So pulling the metadata from all of these files, we can generally find at least like 1 or 2 usernames, and then kind of build a list off of that. So, for example, one organization we were testing, they had a structure that was it was basically like 3 letters appending the initials to their name. So something like EMP ABC. So we basically were able to say, hey, okay, we know that their entire username space is going to be EMP AAA through EMP ZZZ. So we just created a list of all the user space, and then use that user space or use that user list with a single password, something like password 123 spring 2016, and then pointed that password spraying attack against an external OWA portal. And in the screenshot to the right here, you can see where the shorter length on the right, where you see the 4371, that's a different response length. So the actual request to the page generated a different response from the application. Those were actually successful logins. So with Burp Intruder, you can submit multiple payloads and get different results from a web application. The longer results were failed logins. So we were able to show how with Burp Intruder you could actually perform this password spraying attack. Which if you're interested in that, we do have a blog post on that specific thing. And a lot of times, like I said, we'll end up with credentials through that, and then walk into an organization with credentials on the day of testing. So the third thing that we typically like to use, and is still another remote attack, is phishing, which is pretty much known as the golden ticket to any network. So I'm going to talk about 2 different types of phishing. I'm going to talk about credential gathering phishing, as well as attempting to just compromise the system completely. So with credential gathering, one of the things we like to do is clone a site that a user is already trusted in. So our target user that we're going to try to exploit, what can we learn about the organization's external footprint in order to develop a ruse that they will trust? So one of the things that works pretty often for us is cloning like an external OWA portal back to OWA again, just because people are used to signing into that. So then you clone their external login portal and then point them via a phishing attack to log into that portal. And then after they try to log in, it's going to fail, but you will obtain their credentials at that point, usually domain credentials because it's a login to an actual OWA account. And then redirect them to the actual portal. So they just think they mistyped something, and they go about their business and log in, and they're successful. The exploitation side, the primary method that pretty much every attacker is using these days is some sort of macro Word document, or trying to just exploit a browser. So we send macro-enabled Word documents all the time for phishing attacks, and it works gloriously still. One example that me and Joff Thayer did, we did some recon on an organization. We found that they actually had like a health day thing going on previously, and developed a ruse basically saying, hey, we were this company that were at this health day, and we want to provide all these people at this organization a discount to come get 50% off some shoes at our organization. So we created this coupon that said, to actually validate the coupon, you have to enable content, and everyone was clicking it, and we got a ton of shells that way. The bad thing is that people actually were printing it out and taking it into the organization, and we're like, hey, we got this 50% off coupon. That's is it real? So yeah, that might have that came back to bite us a little bit. Remote access. So after we get credentials, it becomes how do we actually get access to a network? Just getting credentials via password spraying or even phishing a user doesn't always mean that we're going to actually have a shell in a network. So we've actually found on a few cases where there's not 2-factor enabled on a VPN or something, and we can just use the credentials to VPN in. A lot of times we'll find RDP externally exposed. One of the things that we like to do as well is if we have access to OWA, phishing from internal accounts to other internal accounts on a domain works gloriously. If you can find like a conversation where somebody's already in like a debate about something, or they have some sort of trust in each other because they know each other internally, and you can pretend to be one of those people because you have access to their Outlook account, getting somebody to click a link at that point becomes very, very easy. And one of my main one of the main things that I've got to like make a point of is that I wouldn't perform any physical attacks. And the reason why is because it kind of brings down the entire OPSEC of everything, because at that point you got a lot of other things to worry about, cameras, getting caught physically. So remote access, like if we don't get access via like a VPN or actually a phishing user to get a shell on a network, I'm not going to actually go and try to walk into a building and log in. I just move on to a different company. So post-exploitation, once we actually get access to a network, there's a lot of things we can do from the point of view of a low-level user in an environment to escalate to domain admin, or even just get like another like network admin's credentials, or pivot around, find sensitive data on the network. So let me talk about a few things we like to do. We have been using PowerShell pretty much exclusively lately, because there's been a number of frameworks that have been built that are very much just friendly for pen testers to take over environments with just PowerShell. And the thing with PowerShell is, there's a lot of debate about how we need to push out application whitelisting, and there's all these AVs kind of up in their game too. But with PowerShell, if you're not actually actively blocking PowerShell, and we can write a tool that does the exact same thing that we want to do during a pen test, we're going to use PowerShell because it's built into Windows. Group policy preference file. So this is the first thing I always look for, GPP, on pretty much any assessment that I do. And the reason is because a lot of organizations think that they are, fully up-to-date patch-wise, and that might be the case. But the thing with group policy preference passwords is that even if your organization is patched completely, if you have not manually removed group policy preference passwords that were previously set from your domain controllers, they're going to still be out there. And a lot of times, organizations have actually set local administrator passwords with group policy preference files. And there's many times where we'll go into an assessment and just run one command, and we already have like local admin, or we've actually ran into times where we'll find domain admin credentials in group policy preference files. Widespread local admin is something we see all the time, where organizations are not randomizing the local administrator credential on workstations within the environment. And if that's the case, you get access to one local admin credential, you can pivot around like a domain admin most of the time. So if you're not randomizing local admin passwords, that's definitely an important thing to look into. Insecure permissions on other systems. So a lot of times we'll have access to a very basic domain account. And if we can talk to every system in the network and say, hey, are we an admin to you? Hey, are we an admin to you? A lot of times we'll find that an administrator has made some mistake on the way by adding some group that shouldn't be in local admins to local admins. For example, we'll find domain users in local admins pretty often, which is, it's always like one system on a network. It's never like a widespread thing, but there's always like one system. And, a lot of times it's like one of like 10,000 systems that has domain users and local admins. And if that's the case, we'll pivot to that system. And then, obviously we have administrative access at that point. We could dump the local password hashes, which might include a local admin. And if they're using the same credential across every system, we can just pass the hash around the network. Internal password spraying, like I mentioned before with external password spraying, it works great. So if we have access to a low level account, we can still talk to the domain. Once we have access to the network, and run netusers/domain, get the user list from the domain, and then password spray internally. One thing that one of our testers actually ran into was pretty awesome recently. She ran into Carrie Roberts ran into a network where she was testing, where the organization set their observation window, so the time in which you could perform a bad password, to 70 days, and there was 5 attempts. So within 70 days time, if you had 5 bad password attempts, you'd be locked out. So kind of a beast of a lockout account policy there, and pretty much prevents password spraying. So yeah. PsExec and Mimikatz combo. So once we actually have administrative credentials, it becomes, well, let's say it's even just local admin credentials. It becomes, finding a way to escalate even more to something like a domain admin. And a lot of times we can use some PowerShell scripts to find where domain admins are logged in on the network. One specific script is from the PowerView PowerShell script. There's a module called User Hunter, And User Hunter will go to every system and say, hey, do you have a domain admin logged into you? Hey, do you have a domain admin logged into you? And it'll craft this awesome list for you that will say, hey, here's where all the domain admins have sessions on the network. And then if you have administrative access to their systems, it essentially just becomes pivoting to those systems, running Mimikatz, and dumping their clear text credentials out of memory. And at that point, you're a domain admin. So after we've escalated within the environment, it becomes looting. What can we dump from the environment? One of our favorite things to do is always pivot to the DC and dump domain hashes because it's just fun to crack everyone's password hash in an environment. A lot of times that can lead to access to other things. Not all the time a domain admin has access to everything. I mean, you would imagine, they're one of the most important roles in a company, but a lot of times specific permissions are set on specific groups that allow users to access certain targets on a network. The other thing I like to do is actually gain access to a vCenter server or any sort of virtualization engine on a network. And the reason is because if you get like a really good admin or somebody who's just really, really on the ball when it comes to administering their virtual environment, a lot of times they organize it really well and it just looks, you log into vCenter and you have, this perfect organization of like, here's our SQL servers, here's our Exchange environment, here's, where all the accounting servers are, all the financing. And the other thing too is a lot of organizations almost have kind of like a blinder of sort up when it comes to virtualizing their environments, and they think, oh, we've segmented our network so well, our PCI environment, you can only access it through an RDP server that you can only access via a certain subnet of the network as a certain user during like a certain time period of the day. And you go and log into vCenter and you find that you just have like console access to everything on the network, and a lot of times you can just console right into the critical environment that you would like to get to. So now it becomes profitizing. So we've compromised an organization, we've escalated privileges, we found where some sensitive data might be. Now it becomes, how do we actually go about turning that into a profit? So some things you could imagine, right? Like you could think, I could be a carder. I could go and try to just install point-of-sale malware on every system and scrape cards from memory, just like the Target hack, and then go sell the cards. But with that, you've got kind of a risk because you might have to keep your command and control server up a lot longer because you're going to have some sort of data exfil that happens over a longer period of time. You could be an identity theft. So let's say you find sensitive health data on a network. Maybe that's your thing. Maybe you want to just sell people's identities. Ransomware has been the main hotness lately. Everyone's doing ransomware because it's pretty much a booming industry. I mean, you hear about a new ransomware attack pretty much every week. Actually, this last week there was a new one where it was entirely encoded in JavaScript, which was pretty interesting. Or you could just be a hacktivist and just mess companies up. So one of the things I saw, there was an article a few months back that basically detailed that some hackers were offering Apple employees like 23 grand for just a basic user credential to their network. Not even like an admin of any sort, just a basic credential. So the thought went through my mind, like if we can compromise organizations, which we do very often in an anonymous way, and we gain access to credentials on a network, what if we just got access to the credentials and then sold those credentials to the carders? Because at that point we are not we're kind of maintaining a very low profile on the attack surface. We build our attack surface, hack a network, escalate, get creds, and then sell them, and then be done with that infrastructure. So I mean, the thing is, like, once you get money, though, it becomes very, very hard. And I apologize, I did include a Bruce Schneier quote in this presentation because it kind of fits perfectly. So it's not that we find criminals like this through cyber forensics. We get them in the real world when they do something stupid. It's invariably how it works. Getting credit cards is easy. Turning it into cash is hard. So at this point, we got to this point where, we built this attack infrastructure and we've compromised an organization, and then trying to profitize off it. It's actually really hard. We talked about Bitcoin being the main thing, but Bitcoin is not untraceable. There's a blockchain, which I'll talk about in a minute, that basically logs every transaction that ever happened on the blockchain. And then turning large amounts of Bitcoin into cash is really not trivial either. So if you have like 100 grand worth of Bitcoin, and you're trying to actually turn that into hard cash, it's not the easiest thing to just go do. I mean, Obviously, ransomware, they've figured out some way to do it that makes it easier for them to go about maintaining anonymity while they do it. But you know, this is the thing that I'm like, okay, well, this is not going to be the easiest thing to bypass when it comes to having perfect anonymity. So there's a site called blockchain.info where you can literally trace every transaction that ever happened on the blockchain. So it's a ledger of every single transaction. For example, here we've got a transaction of $3.4 million in Bitcoin. And that particular transaction can be traced back to every single transaction that happened before it. There's another site called blockseer.com that kind of helps you visually kind of see where those transactions came from. So you can see that one particular payment, $3.9 million, actually traced back to a mixer service. And then even before that, I went back before that. So mixer services basically take in your Bitcoin that you're trying to exchange, and then they mix it up a ton to try to make it look like it's going to different places, to make it a little harder to trace back. But at this point, it really becomes a money laundering problem, and that's not the road we wanted to go down. So we didn't actually go down the money laundering path because we're not criminals. So after we get into let's say we did figure out the whole profitization part, we would do a full rip and replace and then rebuild from scratch for the next job. And the thing to keep in mind here is that actual VPS network infrastructure took maybe like 3 hours to build. And then a lot of times, once we actually have access to any organization's network, many times it's just less than a day's time before we've escalated to domain admin within an environment. So the point being is that a lot of this can happen within a week's time. So we build our infrastructure, attack an organization, make some sort of profit off it, and be done within a week, and then just rip and replace. Be done with the attack infrastructure, move on to different VPS networks, and profit there. So to tell you why we don't do that, I'm going to let Derek jump back in, and we're going to talk about why this is a bad thing and why we wanted to demo what we could do, but it's definitely something that we are not going to do. Derek, take it away.
Yeah, so the first and foremost reason is ethics. I mean, as a couple of slides ago, we said that we're really not criminals. I guess I had the visual of Office Space with us actually looking up money laundering, because none of us knew how to do it, right? We're not really criminals. We have ethics, and we like to think that we're on the right side. Then the inevitability of getting caught. From my days in Blue Team, while this setup might be difficult to track back, I really think that if the full weight of law enforcement came after you, as I've seen a couple questions saying, well, Tor, the NSA can look into Tor. Yeah, I think if the United States government wants to get you, they're going to. So you're going to get caught if you're doing things that get you noticed. And then, of course, the danger of entering in the criminal world. I think that if you start to do criminal type things, you start to associate more with criminals, and well, there's just an inherent risk and danger there. Being a criminal, well, to me, sounds kind of dangerous. I kind of like my job of not being a criminal. So these are why we don't do these things. And then today at lunch, my wife asked me what the webcast was on, and I explained it to her, and her first response was, why would you do that? Why would you tell someone how to go be bad? Well, it's our job to think like bad guys because we think we can make it better. So, for everybody who's in the audience who's an enterprise defender, or even on the attack side, or you're Blue Team, you're a developer, you do forensics, I think we can make this stuff better. So, some of the things that I saw questions being asked, like with password spraying. How do you catch that? John mentioned a couple of products that can do it. I mean, if you can't afford those products, one thing you could do is you could set up a dummy account that no one should be logging into, and then if it ever gets logged into, well, you set up an email alert to say, hey, this account is now being logged into. So the other thing you can do is you can shift your focus from attribution. If you care about who's doing it, look for more detection and prevention type stuff. So, you can increase your logging to detect attackers, to look for things like password spraying with some of those tools, or if you have a SIM now, you could probably set up rules in your SIM to see, is one machine in my environment trying to log in to all these other things. Then from the outside, make sure all your portals are using two-factor authentication. There should be nothing that's publicly facing that doesn't require two factors to get into. And then probably the most important protection against something like password spraying is to increase the length of your passwords. Require all of your users to have 15 or more characters in their passwords. Every time I've done password spraying, if their long passwords are required, I'm just not successful. So those are some of the defense type things you can do. If you're an attacker, if you're a pen tester and you're trying to demonstrate to companies how to prevent against these things, really focus on credential reuse. It's one of the most successful things that we do. So try and find weak credentials and reuse them across the entire organization. If you do find an external facing portal of some sort, like OA or some kind of custom thing, and it looks like internal credentials are being used, go after it with a vengeance. With Burp and Burp Intruder, you're probably going to be successful. And then once you do have access to a domain, you get domain admin, go dump the ntds.dit file and crack passwords, and then go beyond just the domain admin. Look for segmentation in the environment. So if it's like a manufacturer and they have a SCADA group and it's walled off from domain admin, go find that SCADA group and get those credentials and show actual risk in your test.
Thanks, Eric. John, would you like to add any closing notes?
Yep. I just want to echo back what Derek just said. Is we talk about these things because that's our job, right? A lot of you guys are on this call, or you guys are on this webcast simply because we are paid to be offensive-minded people. A lot of the attendees here, whether you're a defender or you're an attacker, we have to think like the attackers. And more importantly, it's important to kind of talk about more concrete approaches for attacking networks that are not pie-in-the-sky unicorn-style attacks. And that's really what we're trying to focus on here. And then, of course, the defenses. And a lot of you guys talked about the defenses. So once again, thank you so much. We're now at the end of this particular webcast. It is time to put this one to bed. It will be recorded. We will share it out with absolutely everybody. Thank you so much for attending, and get out of here. We'll see you in the next one.